Short service announcement. The introductory slide, it's not included, but once that goes, I'm in for the ride. Well, it's better putting it at the beginning than in the end. So,
whenever you're ready.
Okay. I did my PhD on cycling in Belgium before the Second World War, and really my major research question was how cycling in Belgium became a powerful marker of not only a national Belgian identity during this period, but also how the foundations were laid for cycling to become part of the cultural identity of the country's Dutch-speaking part, Flanders. Now, the case of the early 20th century Flemish cyclist Cyriel van Hauwaert offers an interesting perspective on this dynamic, and I'd like to begin, if the slide goes along, with a short word on cycling in Belgium in general. So when the sport's popularity first booms in the 1890s, it gives rise to the first sporting industry in Belgium with its own press, road races, cycling tracks, and body of professional athletes, sponsored by bicycle manufacturers. Nevertheless, the sport was still limited in its social geographical spread, as most of those involved in it were from middle-class urban backgrounds. Around 1900, however, a shift occurs when dropping bicycle prices make the vehicle more broadly available. The sport's democratization that follows from this, however, does not come easy. While the middle classes retreat from cycling, its industry experiences a crisis. Simultaneously, however, cycling becomes popular among the working classes, as an expanding number of local low-threshold street races are now held in towns and villages across the country, often comprising just a few laps through the village. And it is in these races Cyriel van Hauwaert first appears. Van Hauwaert is a farmhand from the village of Moorslede in Western Flanders. Now, buying his first bike around 1900, he becomes interested in the developing racing circuit in his home region, and a few years later successfully participates in these races. Other than most of his fellow riders, however, he soon also attempts to break through in the long-distance road races of nearby France, then the epicenter of professional cycling. And after some false starts, he finishes second in the Paris-Roubaix race in 1907, wins the prestigious Bordeaux-Paris race in the same year, as well as in 1909, and also wins Paris-Roubaix in 1908. So from an unknown athlete, Van Hauwaert fast becomes a pre-war European cycling star, signing lucrative contracts with the French professional cycling teams dominating the sport. Now, as the first to connect this country's new grassroots racing culture to cycling's international stage, his reputation skyrockets in Belgium, which has a catalytic effect on all of cycling's popularity in the country. For instance, ensuring a new growth of the sport press. Now, Van Hauwaert's popularity equally had clear social-cultural ramifications, as his personality is soon seized upon to shape an interlocking set of identities. This was firstly the case in Van Hauwaert's hometown, Moorslede, where he was constructed as a symbol of local civic pride. So, in Moorslede, after both his Bordeaux-Paris wins, local authorities and civil organizations together set up celebrations in his honor, which united thousands of enthusiasts who saw Van Hauwaert escorted by festive parades to the town hall, where the mayor sung his praise, after which he was treated to a banquet. After his 1909 victory, there was even talk of erecting a statue for him. Now, this public, almost ritual honoring of someone whose working class roots were not only evident, but were even celebrated in cycling, was a totally new aspect of local social dynamics, which stimulated a stronger identification with the locality among its ordinary inhabitants. And in this sense, Van Hauwaert's construction as a local icon also served local actors in advancing their own interests. And especially the brothers Richard and Léon Bonte were conspicuously present in Van Hauwaert's public celebrations. Now, while the former was a local bicycle salesman from the French Alcyon brand, Van Hauwaert represented between 1908 and 1910, the latter was actually the town's mayor up until 1925. So while this Léon Bonte, the mayor, clearly aimed at strengthening his political capital through associating with Van Hauwaert, Richard, meanwhile, cultivated the latter's popularity to boost his bicycle sales. Moreover, in 1908 already, he opened a velodrome, a cycling track in Moorslede, which attracted large crowds by prominently featuring Van Hauwaert in its racing events. As such, local identity construction and commercial interests closely interacted. Now, this local identity was then interwoven with overarching regional and national identities, making the town an important site for their reproduction from below. First, Belgian patriotism intermingled with local pride through practices such as the display of national flags or the playing of the national anthem. Outside the town as well, however, Van Hauwaert is continuously seized upon to promote Belgian pride in a period of strong nationalism. Both the press and his autobiography of 1911 are filled with conspicuous illustrations of his supposed patriotism. Thirdly, simultaneously, Van Hauwaert's Flemish background is seized upon by some in the Dutch language press to promote a Flemish cultural identity, as since the mid-19th century, a growing so-called Flemish movement demanded more rights for Belgium's socially, culturally disadvantaged Flemish population. And in doing so, it increasingly represented Flanders as a distinct nation within Belgium. As a symbol of physical force and willpower, Van Hauwaert was soon identified as a good vehicle for promoting this nation. He was, for instance, nicknamed the Flemish Lion in the emerging Flemish sports press, referring to the historical novel on the medieval Battle of the Golden Spurs, which was an important cultural reference for this Flemish movement. In Moorslede itself, for instance, this name was reiterated in speeches as well as in the cries of locals cheering on Van Hauwaert in his homecoming parades. Now, Van Hauwaert's construction as a Flemish symbol went further than the nickname, however. New Flemish sports papers like Sportvriend and its notably pro-Flemish journalists consistently presented Van Hauwaert as a sort of epitome of a Flemish cultural resurrection, which seemed to be confirmed by the growing success of other Flemish racers in the next years. And in doing so, Van Hauwaert was also linked to supposedly essential Flemish cultural characteristics. And the sports press especially stressed his continuing supposed attachment to his modest farming life, living with his widowed father in Moorslede. And by presenting these rural roots as a source of his success, he was linked to the influential cultural myth that Flanders was an inherently rural society. So, to wrap up, we saw how Van Hauwaert was a flexible vehicle for interwoven local, regional, and national identity constructions, which interweaved class, commercialism, and cultural politics. Identities, moreover, which still mostly complemented each other, as only after the Great War, an anti-Belgian Flemish nationalism manifested itself. Lastly, Van Hauwaert's cultural importance was not limited to his active career. Although he quit racing around 1915, he was still a potent Belgian and Flemish identity symbol in the interbellum. And this continuing presence was stimulated by the fact that between the 1920s and 1950s, the commercially savvy Van Hauwaert became a successful bicycle manufacturer who sold a self-named bicycle brand and sponsored Belgian cycling teams. Hence, he also remained an attractive example of social mobility.
How many slides was that?
Well, this was actually a slide to finish with while the questions came, so...
Okay, fine.
10 seconds can't hurt, no?
Okay, questions. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah, I'll go on, Craig.
Okay.
Did Van Hauwaert have any success outside of Belgium?
Yeah. You mean sporting success in terms of... Yeah. So he actually quite soon became a real international cycling star. While doing research, for instance, I found a reference to a small biography on him in Italian even. I've also got copies of a German biography of him. So he raced a lot in France, Italy as well. He won Milan-San Remo in 1908. But he also went across the pond to New York in 1911, competing in the Madison Square 6-day races. Which is also a very interesting aspect because apparently he was contracted by one of the major sporting entrepreneurs of the time, Pat Powers, to come over to New York.